The small New England town of Ashford was a postcard brought to life. Snow blanketed the streets in a clean, pristine white, muffling the usual sounds of life. Every window glowed warmly with twinkling lights or candle flames, and garlands of evergreen wound tightly around the lampposts. The town square's massive fir tree sparkled with ornaments and tinsel, its base piled with gift-wrapped boxes purely for show. Nora Harris barely noticed the idyllic scenery as she turned onto Maple Lane, her car tires crunching over the snow-packed driveway of her childhood home. The house, a cozy Cape Cod with blue shutters and a chimney that perpetually puffed smoke in the winter, looked exactly as it had every Christmas. But this year, it felt hollow, as if the spirit of the season had been dampened. This was the first Christmas without Eleanor Hastings, Nora's grandmother, and the family's undisputed matriarch. Gran would have had a wreath on every window by now, Nora murmured as she turned off the ignition. She glanced at the tin box on the passenger seat beside her, its lids scuffed from decades of use. Her fingers traced its edge absently before she scooped it up and made her way to the porch. Inside, the house smelled of pine, cinnamon, and the faint sweetness of gingerbread scent that had always signaled Christmas was near. Her mother, Emma, greeted her at the door with a hug. "You're freezing," Emma chided. "Get in here before you turn into a popsicle. Ethan's in the living room pretending he's helping." Nora smiled faintly, though her heart felt heavy as she stepped into the warmth. The space was exactly as she remembered. Stockings hung neatly over the stone fireplace, a modest tree glimmering with lights and ornaments, and the centerpiece, a hand-carved nativity scene Eleanor had cherished for as long as Nora could remember. "Hey, Sherlock!" her brother Ethan called from the couch, a plate of cookies balanced precariously on his lap. "Find anything good in the attic?" Nora held up the tin box. "I think so." The box had belonged to Eleanor, who had kept it stored away in a battered old trunk in the attic. Nora had discovered it earlier that day, hidden beneath piles of faded linens. The trunk was full of family heirlooms, but the box had caught her attention immediately. It had been a centerpiece of their Christmases for years, until Eleanor had grown too frail to bring it down herself. "What's in it?" Ethan asked, craning his neck to get a better look. "Christmas cards," Nora said, setting the box down on the dining room table. Ethan groaned. "Seriously? You hauled that thing down for some old cards?" "These aren't just any cards," Nora said, opening the lid. "Gran used to say they were little pieces of people's lives. She'd read them every year, remember? All the stories about her friends and family, the ones who'd sent them." Her voice trailed off as the memory surfaced, a younger Eleanor by the fire, her glasses perched on her nose, carefully opening each card and sharing its contents with the family. Her mother joined her at the table, a small smile tugging at her lips. "She always did love her cards. I think she saved every single one." Nora began sorting through the collection. The cards were tied in neat bundles by year, each stack carefully labeled. As she worked, a sense of nostalgia washed over her. Some of the names and messages were familiar: neighbors, distant relatives, old friends Eleanor had mentioned over the years. But one card at the bottom of the box made her pause. Its envelope was different from the rest, faded and slightly yellowed with age, and brittle at the edges. The handwriting on the front was unmistakable. Eleanor's elegant cursive. But it wasn't addressed to anyone Nora recognized. To Elizabeth Sommers, 1124 West Elm Street, Chicago, Illinois. The postmark read December 1968, and the envelope was still sealed. "Mom," Nora said, holding up the envelope, "do you know who Elizabeth Sommers is?" Emma frowned as she leaned in for a closer look. "No, I don't think so. Where did you find that?" "It was in the box," Nora said, "but it's unopened." Her mother took the envelope and studied it with a curious expression. "I've never heard that name before. Maybe she was an old friend of Gran's." "Gran was careful about sending cards," Nora said, her brow furrowing. "Why wouldn't she have sent this one? And why keep it for over 50 years? Emma shrugged, but her eyes lingered on the envelope. "Your grandmother didn't talk much about her younger years. Maybe this was someone she lost touch with." "Or someone she didn't want to lose touch with," Nora said softly. Her mother glanced at her, a faint shadow of worry crossing her face. "Don't overthink it, honey. Sometimes a forgotten card is just a forgotten card." But the envelope felt like more than that. The name Elizabeth Sommers etched itself into Nora's mind as she carefully placed the card back into the box. That night, after the house had gone quiet, Nora sat on the edge of her childhood bed, the unopened card resting on her lap. The questions it raised refused to let her sleep. Who was Elizabeth Sommers? Why had her grandmother never sent the card? And why had she kept it all these years? Nora reached for her laptop and began typing. Elizabeth Sommers, Chicago, Illinois. The search results were overwhelming. There were dozens of Elizabeths, many of them far too young or entirely unconnected to Ashford. But Nora wasn't ready to give up. There was a story behind that card. She was sure of it. The next morning, while helping her mother sort through an old photo album, Nora found another clue. Tucked between the pages was a photograph she didn't recognize. It showed Eleanor, much younger, standing arm in arm with another woman. Both were smiling, their cheeks pink from the cold. On the back, in Eleanor's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Ellie and Liz, Christmas 1946. Nora's breath caught as she stared at the photograph. The woman beside Eleanor could only be Elizabeth Sommers. But why had her grandmother never mentioned her? And why had she kept the card a secret for over 50 years? The photograph weighed heavily in Nora's hands as she sat cross-legged on the floor of the living room. Eleanor's youthful smile, so full of life, was a stark contrast to the reserved, sometimes wistful expression Nora remembered from her later years. And then there was the other woman, Liz. Who was she? And why had her grandmother never spoken of her? Nora flipped the photograph over again, her eyes tracing the inscription, "Ellie and Liz, Christmas 1946. The handwriting was unmistakable, the same elegant script that adorned the envelope addressed to Elizabeth Sommers. "Find something interesting?" Ethan's voice startled her. Nora glanced up to see her brother leaning against the doorway, his arms crossed. "Maybe," she said, holding up the photo. "Recognize her?" Ethan squinted, then shook his head. "Never seen her before. Who is she?" "Elizabeth Sommers," Nora said, her voice tinged with mystery. "The woman Gran wrote that card to." Ethan frowned. "And you're sure Gran never mentioned her?" "Not once," Nora said. "But they were clearly close. Look at this." She handed him the photograph, watching his expression shift as he studied it. "Yeah, they look tight," Ethan said, handing it back. "But that was what, 70-something years ago? Maybe it's just ancient history." "Maybe," Nora said, though she didn't believe it. "But why keep the card all this time if it didn't matter?" "Because Gran was sentimental?" Ethan offered. Nora rolled her eyes. "It's more than that, I know it is." Ethan shrugged. "All right, Nancy Drew. Keep me posted when you solve the mystery of the ancient Christmas card." As Ethan wandered off, Nora turned her attention back to the tin box. There was nothing else in it that mentioned Elizabeth, but the photograph felt like a breadcrumb, leading her deeper into her grandmother's untold story. The next day, armed with the photograph and the unopened card, Nora drove to the Ashford Historical Society. The small building, tucked between the library and an antique shop, smelled faintly of old paper and wood polish. "Can I help you?" asked a friendly older man behind the counter. His name tag read Harold Jones, volunteer. "I hope so," Nora said, pulling the photo from her bag. "I'm looking for information about my grandmother, Eleanor Hastings, and this woman, Elizabeth Sommers. They were friends, I think, a long time ago." Harold adjusted his glasses and took the photo, his brow furrowing as he examined it. "Eleanor Hastings," he murmured. "The name's familiar. Wasn't she married to Charles Hastings?" "That's right," Nora said. "She lived here in Ashford most of her life." Harold nodded slowly. "I think we might have something on her. Give me a moment." He disappeared into a back room, leaving Nora to wander the small space. Framed photographs of Ashford through the years lined the walls, and a collection of artifacts from the town's past sat in glass cases. When Harold returned, he was holding a file folder. "This is what we've got," he said, setting it on the counter. Inside were newspaper clippings, old photographs, and notes about Eleanor's involvement in local events. But what caught Nora's eye was a single line in a handwritten note. Eleanor Hastings and Elizabeth Sommers, 1947. Local scandal involving Hastings family. Scandal? Nora repeated, looking up at Harold. He nodded gravely. From what I understand, Eleanor and Elizabeth were very close friends. But something happened in 1947 that caused a rift. They had a falling out in 1947, something about family obligations. Elizabeth left town shortly after, and they were never seen together again. Nora's heart sank. A rift. The word felt heavy, like the weight of years spent apart. Do you know where Elizabeth went? She asked. Chicago, if I'm not mistaken, Harold said. That's what the records suggest anyway. Nora thanked him and left the Historical Society with more questions than answers. What could have caused such a rift between Eleanor and Elizabeth? And why had her grandmother kept the card, unopened, for so many years? That evening, back at her parents' house, Nora sat by the fire, the unopened card in her lap. Her mother was knitting in the armchair nearby, her movements rhythmic and calming. Mom, Nora said hesitantly. Emma looked up, her brow arching in curiosity. Yes? Do you think Gran ever regretted something from her past? This card, Nora said, holding it up. It feels like it was meant to fix something, like maybe she wanted to make amends. Emma set her knitting aside. What makes you ask that? Emma's expression softened. Your grandmother had a way of keeping things close to her chest. She didn't talk much about her past, especially not before she married your grandfather. But I think everyone has regrets, don't you? Nora nodded, her gaze drifting back to the card. Are you going to open it? Emma asked gently. I don't know, Nora admitted. Part of me feels like I should, but the other part... She trailed off, unsure how to explain the strange sense of reverence she felt toward the envelope. Emma gave her a small, encouraging smile. Whatever you decide, I think Gran would understand. Later that night, unable to resist any longer, Nora carefully slid a letter opener under the flap of the envelope. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the card inside, a simple design with a holly wreath on the front. Inside was a handwritten note, Eleanor's elegant script filling the page. Dearest Liz, I've thought of you every Christmas since we parted ways. I've carried the weight of our falling out for far too long, and I can't let another year pass without telling you how sorry I am. You were my dearest friend, and I let you down. I hope, wherever you are, that you can forgive me. I hope it's not too late to make things right. Yours always, Ellie. Nora's breath caught as she read the words. This wasn't just a Christmas card, it was a plea for forgiveness, a bridge Eleanor had tried to build but never crossed. Nora clutched the card tightly, her mind racing. Why hadn't her grandmother sent it? And if Elizabeth Sommers was still alive, could Nora be the one to deliver the apology her grandmother never could? The snow outside Nora's window seemed to glisten under the moonlight, its quiet presence contrasting sharply with the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. The card rested on her desk, the delicate handwriting glaring at her like a reproach. It felt almost intrusive to have read something so deeply personal. Yet Nora couldn't shake the feeling that this message was meant to find its way to Elizabeth. The next morning, Nora shared the card with her brother, Ethan. Wait, he said, holding the letter at arm's length as if it might bite him. So, you're telling me Gran had a best friend she never told anyone about, then wrote this guilt-drenched apology and didn't send it? That's heavy. Nora sighed. Exactly. And the more I think about it, the more I feel like I need to find Elizabeth or her family at least. This apology can't stay stuck in the past. Ethan scratched his head. And how exactly are you planning to do that? Hire a private investigator? Because I gotta tell you, my Christmas bonus won't cover that. Her brother gawked at her. You're serious? You're just gonna hop on a plane and track down some random lady who might not even be alive anymore? Nora rolled her eyes. I'll figure it out, but I think the first step is Chicago. The address on the envelope is the only concrete clue we have. It's not random, Nora said firmly. It's Gran, and if she kept this card for 50 years, then it mattered to her. Don't you think we owe it to her to try? Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. All right, fine. But if you don't come back with a Hallmark movie ending, I'm going to make fun of you for the rest of your life. The decision was made. 2 days later, armed with a plane ticket, the card, and the photograph, Nora landed in Chicago. The city was bustling with holiday cheer. Shoppers crowded the magnificent mile, bundled up against the biting wind, and street musicians played carols on every corner. But Nora barely noticed. Her focus was on 1124 West Elm Street. When she arrived at the address, her heart sank. The house was still there, but it had been converted into a law office decades ago. Inside, a receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "Can I help you?" Nora explained her situation, her words tumbling over each other in nervous excitement. The receptionist listened patiently, then typed something into her computer. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "We don't have any records of the previous owners before the 1980s, but if you're looking for historical information, the Chicago Public Library has an excellent archives department." Nora thanked her and left, clutching the card tightly as she made her way to the library. The archivist on duty was a sharp-eyed woman named Carla, who seemed to take an immediate interest in Nora's quest. "This is intriguing," Carla said, studying the photograph and the card. "Let me see what I can find." For the next 2 hours, Carla scoured old directories, newspaper clippings, and census records. Nora watched anxiously as the librarian worked, her fingers tapping impatiently on the table. Finally, Carla looked up with a triumphant smile. "Got her," she said. "Elizabeth Sommers. She lived at 1124 West Elm Street until 1974, then moved to a retirement community in Oak Park." "Is she—" Nora hesitated, afraid to ask. Carla's expression softened. "She passed away in 2003. Nora's chest tightened. She had known it was a possibility. Elizabeth would have been in her late 70s or early 80s by then, but hearing it confirmed felt like a door slamming shut. "But," Carla continued, "it looks like she had a daughter, Margaret Sommers. She still lives in the area. Would you like her contact information?" Nora nodded quickly, her pulse racing. This wasn't over. The next morning, Nora found herself standing outside a modest suburban home in Oak Park. She clutched the photograph and the card in one hand, her other hand hovering uncertainly near the doorbell. Finally, she took a deep breath and pressed the button. A woman in her 60s answered the door. Her hair was streaked with gray, and her eyes were sharp but kind. "Margaret Sommers?" Nora asked. "Yes," the woman replied, her brow furrowing in curiosity. Margaret's expression shifted from confusion to surprise. "Eleanor Hastings? My mother used to talk about her sometimes. She always called her Ellie." "My name is Nora Harris," Nora began. "I'm the granddaughter of Eleanor Hastings. I think your mother, Elizabeth, was close friends with her a long time ago." Nora smiled faintly. "I found this among my grandmother's things," she said, holding out the card. "It's addressed to your mother. I think Gran wanted her to have it, but for some reason, she never sent it." This is incredible," she said. "My mother always spoke fondly of Ellie, but she never told me why they stopped talking. I always wondered." Margaret took the card, her hands trembling as she opened it. She read the message silently, her eyes glistening with tears. When she finished, she looked up at Nora. Nora hesitated. "Do you know what happened between them?" Margaret nodded slowly. "From what my mother told me, they had a falling out over something trivial at least. That's how it seemed to her later in life. But at the time, it felt huge. They were young, and pride got in the way." She smiled sadly. "My mother always regretted losing touch with Ellie. She even tried to find her once, but by then, too much time had passed." Nora's throat tightened. She forgave her then. Margaret's smile grew warmer. "Oh, absolutely. She used to say that if she ever saw Ellie again, she'd tell her they were square." Relief washed over Nora like a wave. Her grandmother's apology, though late, had been answered in spirit. As Margaret handed the card back to Nora, she hesitated. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the house. When she returned, she was holding an old leather-bound journal. "This was my mother's," Margaret said. It's full of stories about her life, including her friendship with Ellie. I think you should have it." Nora opened the journal to the first page, her heart pounding as she read the inscription, "For Ellie, my forever friend." Nora placed the journal back on Margaret's coffee table, her heart heavy but full. "They spent all those years apart," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "but they never stopped caring about each other." Margaret nodded, her own eyes glistening. "My mother used to say some connections don't need to be constant to be real. She always held Ellie close in her heart, even when they couldn't be together." Nora smiled faintly. "I think Gran felt the same way." She hesitated, then added, "It makes me think about my own friendships. There are people I've drifted away from, and maybe I've let pride get in the way too. But seeing how much they regretted losing each other." She trailed off, shaking her head. "I don't want to make the same mistake." "I think about Sarah," Nora said softly. "We were inseparable in college, but after that fight about my graduation party, it felt easier to just let things go. I haven't spoken to her in years. Maybe I've been scared of what she'd say if I tried." Margaret gave a knowing smile. "Sometimes the hardest part is reaching out first." Margaret opened a small drawer near the table and pulled out a gold locket. Inside, there was a tiny photo of Elizabeth and Eleanor, their arms around each other, smiling brightly. "She never stopped carrying this," Margaret said, her voice trembling. "Even when she grew older and couldn't remember much else." Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. "Then maybe that's the real gift they've given us, a reminder to hold on to what matters." Nora's throat tightened as she held the locket. Gran would have loved to know that. They sat in silence for a long moment, the quiet punctuated by the soft hum of Christmas music drifting from the kitchen. Margaret stood abruptly. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the other room. Nora heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, the scrape of something being pulled from a shelf. When Margaret returned, she was holding a weathered cardboard box. "These are some of my mother's things," she explained. "She kept every letter, every photograph, every little thing that reminded her of Ellie. I've gone through it before, but now that I've read this card..." She gestured to the card still lying open on the table. "Maybe there's more to understand." Margaret placed the box on the table, and together they began to sort through its contents. The first layer was a jumble of photographs, most of them black and white, some colorized. There were pictures of Elizabeth as a young woman, smiling shyly at the camera. Nora's breath caught when she saw one of Eleanor and Elizabeth together, arms slung over each other's shoulders in front of what looked like a county fair. "This was from the summer before the falling out," Margaret said softly. "Mom always said that was one of the happiest times of her life." As they dug deeper, they found letters, some from Eleanor, some from Elizabeth's other friends and family. One in particular caught Nora's attention. "This one's from 1948, she said, holding it up. Margaret leaned closer as Nora read the letter aloud. "Dearest Ellie, I saw you in town today, but you didn't see me. You looked so beautiful, and for a moment, I almost called your name. But then I remembered what you said, that we both needed to let go. I'm trying, Ellie. I swear I'm trying. But it's hard to let go of someone who feels like a piece of your soul." Nora's voice wavered as she finished. She could feel the depth of Elizabeth's pain, the way it had lingered even as time pressed forward. "Forever missing you, Liz." Margaret wiped her eyes, laughing softly. "Mom always was a bit of a poet. I think she wrote this to herself as much as to Ellie. She never sent it. She never could bring herself to." Nora nodded, understanding all too well the weight of unsent words. She thought of the card Eleanor had written, its plea for forgiveness. "Do you think they ever forgave themselves?" she asked quietly. Margaret was silent for a long moment. "I think they wanted to. Maybe they couldn't say it out loud, but I think they forgave each other in their hearts. At least, I like to think so." That evening, back in Ashford, Nora couldn't shake the sense of purpose that had settled over her. Eleanor's story and Elizabeth's wasn't just about the past. It was about connection, about how even the bonds we think are broken can endure in unexpected ways. "You know," Ethan began, staring into the fire, Gran once got into a huge fight with me because I forgot to pick her up from choir practice. She didn't talk to me for days. I never understood how she could be so stubborn, but maybe I get it now. Maybe I have that same streak." His voice softened. "It's scary how easy it is to let things go unsaid." Her family was gathered around the fire when she arrived, the smell of cider and pine filling the air. Nora joined them, holding the scrapbook she and Margaret had made. "I want to show you something," she said. As the fire crackled softly, Nora shared the story of Eleanor and Elizabeth's friendship. She told them about the journal, the letters, and the unsent card. Her mother listened with tears streaming down her cheeks, and even Ethan seemed unusually somber. "Gran carried that regret with her all these years," Nora said, her voice steady. "But it wasn't just regret. It was love. She and Liz couldn't find their way back to each other, but they never let go of what they had." Her mother reached out, placing a hand on Nora's arm. "Gran would have been so proud of you for finding this, for telling their story." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, Nora stayed awake by the fire. She held the journal in her lap, tracing the inscription on the front page. "For Ellie, my forever friend." The snow outside seemed to shimmer under the moonlight, casting faint patterns on the living room walls. Nora felt a quiet peace settle over her, as though the house itself was holding its breath in reverence. For a moment, she thought she felt something, a warmth, a presence that couldn't be explained. She smiled to herself, brushing away a stray tear. "Gran," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I hope I did right by you." Some stories, she thought, don't need perfect endings to be meaningful. They just need to be told. The next morning, Christmas Day dawned bright and cold. As the family gathered for breakfast, Nora noticed the scrapbook and journal on the mantel, sitting beside Eleanor's cherished nativity set. Ethan nudged her, his tone teasing but kind. "So, Nancy Drew, what's the next mystery? Solving world peace?" Nora laughed. "Not this week." But in her heart, she knew this wasn't the end of her journey. It was only the beginning of something deeper, a commitment to the connections that defined her, both past and present. As the family exchanged gifts, shared stories, and laughed together, Nora felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in years. That night, as snow fell softly outside, Nora opened her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitation building like a lump in her throat. Finally, she began typing. "Hi, Sarah. I know it's been a long time, but I was thinking about you today. Can we talk?" She hit send before she could second-guess herself, feeling a small but certain weight lift from her chest. Eleanor's legacy wasn't just in the stories she'd left behind. It was in the love she'd instilled in her family, the way she taught them to hold on to what mattered. And as the snow fell softly outside, Nora silently promised herself that she would carry that legacy forward.